Crimson drops beaded across the nursery wall like dewdrops, each one spelling out letters that hadn't been there moments before. The words, "She knows," materialized in rust-colored streaks that dripped down the yellow paint, pooling on the hardwood floor where Charlotte had placed the cheerful rainbow rug just yesterday. More writing emerged beneath it. Daddy's secret. The letters carved deep enough into the drywall that white powder scattered to the floor like bone dust. Charlotte pressed her trembling fingers against her lips, staring at the impossible message. The Chucky doll sat propped against the opposite wall where she'd left it after unwrapping it from the toy store bag, its plastic blue eyes reflecting the afternoon light streaming through the blinds. She'd specifically asked for a teddy bear, something soft and comforting for her 3-year-old daughter Mia's room. But the elderly shop owner had insisted this vintage doll was exactly what the child needed. The bleeding letters began to fade, leaving only faint rust-colored stains that could have been mistaken for water damage. Charlotte's rational mind grasped for explanations. Old pipes, humidity, her exhaustion from months of sleepless nights since Mia's father had abandoned them both. But as she watched, new words carved themselves into the wall beside the first message. He left because he knew. Charlotte's knees buckled. The financial ruin that followed Thomas's departure had forced her to sell their suburban home and move into this cramped apartment with Mia. She'd told everyone, her mother, her friends, even herself, that Thomas had simply couldn't handle fatherhood. But the truth sat like a stone in her stomach. He'd discovered something about Charlotte's past, something she'd buried so deep she'd almost convinced herself it never happened. The sound of children's laughter echoed from somewhere inside the walls, high and distorted, like a recording played at the wrong speed. Charlotte spun toward the sound, but the apartment was silent except for the distant hum of traffic. Mia was still at daycare. Charlotte had planned to surprise her with a new toy to make up for all the things they could no longer afford. She approached the wall cautiously, her fingers hovering inches from the fresh stains. The blood, if it was blood, felt warm against her palm when she finally touched it. The moment her skin made contact, more words etched themselves across the surface. 16 years old, basement, Uncle Richard. Charlotte yanked her hand back as if burned. Her Uncle Richard had died in a car accident when she was 17. No one knew what had happened in his basement during those summer visits. No one except Thomas, who'd found her old diary 3 months ago while packing boxes for their move. The Chucky doll's head turned with a soft mechanical whir. Charlotte blinked hard, certain she'd imagined it. But when she looked again, the doll's face was angled toward her, its painted smile somehow wider than before. The afternoon light hadn't shifted, but shadows pooled around the toy like spilled ink. Her phone flickered and died, despite showing a full battery moments earlier. When she returned to the nursery with Mia's backup nightlight, the walls had erupted in a frenzy of red script. Every surface bore writing now. The ceiling, the baseboards, even the inside of the closet. The messages layered over each other in different handwriting styles. She never said no. 16 is old enough. Good girls don't tell. Thomas saw the truth. Charlotte's breath came in short gasps. These were Richard's words, phrases he'd whispered in that musty basement, while her parents thought she was upstairs watching television. Words she'd never written down, never spoken aloud, never even allowed herself to think. The Chucky doll stood upright now, balanced impossibly on its small plastic feet. Its striped shirt bore fresh bloodstains that matched the wall writing, and when Charlotte aimed the flashlight directly at its face, she saw her own 16-year-old reflection staring back from its blue eyes. "You were supposed to stay buried," she whispered. The doll's mouth moved, and Richard's voice emerged, deeper than any child's toy should produce. "Children's secrets make the best confessions, Charlotte. Walls remember everything." The apartment suddenly felt smaller, the air thicker. Charlotte tried the front door, but the handle wouldn't turn. The deadbolt had somehow engaged from the inside, though she distinctly remembered leaving it unlocked. The windows were painted shut, their frames warped, as if the building itself was closing in around her. She needed to reach Mia before the daycare called child services again. The caseworker had already expressed concerns about Charlotte's emotional stability following Thomas's departure. If she was late for pickup again, if she showed up in this panicked state, they might remove Mia from her custody entirely. The writing on the walls began to shift, rearranging itself into new configurations. Names appeared, dozens of them, all children's names with ages and dates spanning decades. Some were scratched so deep into the drywall that Charlotte could see the wooden studs beneath. Others seemed to float just beneath the paint surface, visible only when the light caught them at certain angles. The pattern became clear as Charlotte studied the blood-soaked messages. This wasn't random supernatural activity. It was systematic documentation. Each name corresponded to an apartment number, each date to a specific time frame. The walls weren't just bleeding, they were serving as a vast filing system for something unspeakable. Charlotte grabbed a screwdriver from the kitchen junk drawer. If something was hidden in these walls, some device creating the writing, she would find it. Her background in electrical engineering had taught her to trust logic over hysteria, to trace problems to their source. She pressed her ear against the wall where the first message had appeared. No pipes, no electrical humming, just the sound of something scratching from inside the drywall like fingernails against wood. When she tapped the surface with the screwdriver handle, it echoed hollow in places, solid in others. The Chucky doll laughed, not the mechanical giggle typical of children's toys, but Richard's low chuckle, the sound he'd made when she tried to hide under his workbench. "He built this place for girls like you," the doll said, its voice now clearly coming from its plastic mouth despite the lack of any visible speakers. "Walls that listen, walls that remember, walls that confess." Fresh writing appeared across the ceiling in Richard's distinctive handwriting. Building purchased 1987. Renovations completed 1989. First tenant, apartment 4. Single mother, daughter age 7. Charlotte drove the screwdriver into the drywall. White powder cascaded to the floor, revealing a hollow space behind. She pulled away chunks of plaster until her fingers found something solid. A leather-bound journal wedged between the studs. The cover bore Richard's name in gold lettering, and the pages inside contained detailed floor plans of the apartment building. But these weren't architectural drawings. They were maps marking the location of hiding spots, escape routes, and what Richard had labeled confession chambers. Each apartment had been modified, the walls honeycombed with hidden compartments containing decades of journals, photographs, and locks of hair. A loose photograph fell from between the pages. Charlotte at 16, sleeping in Richard's basement, unaware that he'd been documenting everything. Other children filled the background, dozens of them, spanning decades based on their clothing and hairstyles. The writing on the walls intensified. Apartment 3B, Jennifer, age 8. Apartment 5A, Kevin, age 12. Apartment 2C, Olivia, age 15. Apartment 4A, Charlotte, age 16. Charlotte understood with sickening clarity. This wasn't just Richard's apartment building. It was his hunting ground, designed to trap families in crisis, to isolate vulnerable children. The walls themselves were confession chambers, soaking up secrets and trauma like sponges, preserving them for Richard's collection. The Chucky doll moved closer, its plastic feet clicking against the hardwood. "He picked you special, Charlotte. Broken homes make broken children. Broken children make the best secrets." More photographs spilled from the journal, surveillance shots taken through hidden cameras, children playing in their bedrooms, unaware they were being watched. Charlotte recognized the angles. These had been taken from inside the walls themselves. Richard had turned the entire building into a monitoring system. The doll's eyes flickered with a faint red light, and Charlotte realized it was transmitting everything to some remote location. Even in death, Richard's system continued collecting data, documenting new victims for whoever had inherited his network. Charlotte's training kicked in despite her terror. Every system had a power source. Every network had a central hub. Richard's journal showed a basement control room directly beneath her apartment, marked with technical specifications for a surveillance hub. She had 40 minutes before daycare pickup. The building's hallways felt endless. As Charlotte descended the narrow staircase, Richard's journal clutched against her chest. Emergency lighting cast sickly yellow shadows that seemed to move independently of her flashlight beam. The basement door stood slightly ajar, revealing absolute darkness beyond. The air grew thicker as she descended, heavy with the smell of copper and something sweetly rotting. Motion sensors activated overhead fluorescence, revealing a corridor lined with reinforced steel doors, each labeled with apartment numbers and dates. Charlotte found the room marked in Richard's journal. Inside, the entire space was lined with glass containers filled with preserved blood, each one labeled with a child's name, age, and apartment number. Copper wiring connected the containers to a central machine that hummed with electricity, its displays showing real-time monitoring of every apartment above. Richard hadn't just been a predator, he'd been an engineer, using the building's infrastructure to collect and preserve psychological trauma. The machine fed on fear, on secrets, on the specific frequency of a child's terror. Charlotte's arrival with Mia had activated systems dormant since Richard's death. Banks of monitors showed live feeds from hidden cameras throughout the building. Charlotte saw her own apartment, the nursery where the Chucky doll still sat transmitting. Other screens displayed different apartments, other families, other children who had no idea they were being watched. The Chucky doll appeared at the basement entrance, somehow having followed her down 3 flights of stairs. Now Charlotte could see the truth. It wasn't possessed or supernatural. It was a sophisticated recording device, equipped with cameras and speakers, connected wirelessly to Richard's collection system. "Time for your final confession," the doll said in Richard's voice. Charlotte located the main power coupling, a junction box that connected the entire system to the building's electrical grid. Her electrical engineering degree had covered systems exactly like this, though designed for legitimate purposes. She used the screwdriver to pry open the housing, revealing decades-old wiring that violated every safety code she knew. The walls around her began bleeding more violently, words appearing faster than she could read them. Confessions from children spanning 30 years, all preserved in Richard's electronic cemetery. But Charlotte wasn't 16 anymore. She wasn't helpless. She grabbed a metal fire extinguisher from the corner and began systematically destroying the monitoring equipment. Sparks exploded from each machine as screens went dark and the humming died. But destroying the monitors wasn't enough. Charlotte found Richard's master control panel, a sophisticated system that connected to similar setups in other buildings across the city. This wasn't just one predator's lair, it was a network. The Chucky doll's voice grew distorted as its connection faltered. She was my favorite. She was. They all were. Charlotte ripped cables from their housings, her engineering knowledge guiding her to the critical junction points. She found backup batteries, redundant systems, hidden servers that had been quietly uploading data to remote locations. Everything had to be destroyed. The basement filled with smoke as electrical fires spread across the surveillance equipment. Charlotte gathered armfuls of evidence, hard drives, photographs, Richard's journals documenting his methods, and his network of collaborators. When the building's emergency sprinkler system activated, she was already running up the stairs, the evidence secured in a waterproof bag. Back in her apartment, Charlotte grabbed Mia's essential items and the toy store receipt that would help police trace the doll distribution network. The walls had stopped bleeding, but faint red stains remained, evidence that investigators would need to see. The toy store owner had been part of it. Charlotte realized this as she drove toward the daycare. The vintage Chucky doll had been a trigger, designed to activate dormant systems when placed in apartments of vulnerable families. How many other parents had received the wrong toy? She called the police from the daycare parking lot. When Detective Jennifer Martinez arrived to take her statement, Charlotte presented the evidence methodically. Photographs, technical specifications, financial records showing Richard's purchase of multiple properties across the city. "We've been tracking similar reports for months," the detective admitted. "Missing children, families who moved suddenly without explanation. But we never found the connection until now." 3 weeks later, Charlotte and Mia sat in a new apartment across town, boxes still unpacked around them. The news had covered the fire that gutted the old building, though not the basement discovery that had led to the arrest of 6 elderly men connected to Richard's network. The investigation had expanded to include properties in 4 other cities. Mia played quietly with her new teddy bear, a simple brown bear Charlotte had purchased from a different store entirely. But sometimes, late at night, Charlotte still heard scratching from inside the walls of their new home. Sometimes, she found herself standing in Mia's doorway, watching for signs of bleeding on the fresh white paint. The trauma counselor said these were normal symptoms of PTSD, that her hypervigilance around her daughter's safety was understandable. But Charlotte knew the truth was more complicated. Richard's confession engine had awakened something in her, not supernatural, but psychological. She'd spent 16 years burying her own voice, letting shame and fear keep her silent. Now she listened to walls differently, not for supernatural bleeding, but for the real sounds of children in distress, for the subtle signs that predators leave in their wake. She'd started volunteering with a local advocacy group, using her engineering background to help law enforcement identify technological tools used by predators. The scratching in the walls turned out to be mice. Charlotte called an exterminator and had the apartment thoroughly inspected. The building was clean, but she installed her own security system anyway. One she'd designed herself, with protocols that would alert authorities if anyone attempted unauthorized access. She kept Richard's journal, along with the photographs and documentation she'd found in his basement. Evidence that would help prosecutors in the ongoing investigation. Proof that would give voices to children who'd been silenced for decades. The Chucky doll had been incinerated with the rest of Richard's collection, but Charlotte could still picture its painted smile, could still hear the distorted recording of her uncle's voice. She'd learned that monsters didn't need supernatural powers to haunt their victims. They just needed silence, shame, and walls that kept secrets. During therapy sessions, Charlotte practiced speaking the words she'd never been able to say aloud. The walls in Dr. Patricia's office remained clean and white, but Charlotte imagined them absorbing her story differently, not as confession fodder for a predator's collection, but as testimony that could help other survivors find their voices. Mia adapted to their new home with the resilience of childhood, delighting in the teddy bear and the sense of security that came from living in a place where her mother smiled more often. She had no memory of the brief time they'd spent in Richard's building, no exposure to the horrors that had unfolded there. Charlotte remained vigilant, learning to read the subtle signs that predators left behind. Buildings with too many single mothers, landlords who offered below-market rent to families in crisis, toy stores that seemed to know exactly which families had recently moved to new addresses. The investigation expanded beyond Richard's immediate network. Charlotte testified before a grand jury, her engineering expertise helping prosecutors understand the technical sophistication of the surveillance system. Other survivors came forward, their own stories of walls that seemed to bleed with secrets they'd never shared with anyone. Sometimes, when Mia laughed while playing with her teddy bear, Charlotte felt something inside her chest loosen, not healing exactly, but acknowledgement. The walls would never bleed again, but they would always remember. And for the first time in her life, Charlotte thought that might be enough. The city eventually demolished Richard's building, but not before Charlotte and a team of investigators had documented every hidden camera, every concealed recording device, every modification he'd made to turn innocent walls into instruments of psychological torture. The evidence led to reforms in building inspection protocols and new laws requiring disclosure of previous ownership by convicted predators. Charlotte's apartment remained quiet, its walls clean and ordinary. But she'd learned that the most dangerous monsters were often the most methodical ones, those who turned everyday spaces into hunting grounds through patience and planning rather than supernatural power. She'd bought a teddy bear and received a Chucky doll instead. But in the end, she'd given that doll exactly what it deserved: silence, darkness, and the purifying flame that reduced Richard's legacy to ash. The walls no longer bled with secrets, but they bore witness to something more powerful, the voice of a survivor who had finally learned to speak her truth aloud.